We have the highest inflation in the G7.
Hi, Angus.
Someone should tell Angus Taylor we're not actually in the G7. But if you look at the countries which are in the G7, I've just come from the United Kingdom. Overseas have higher inflation rates in places like that. The United States has a much higher interest rate than Australia as well. There is global inflation out there. That's having an impact. We're not immune in Australia's economy from global impacts.
We have the highest inflation in the G7.
It's actually some G7 economies where inflation is higher than Australia, not in Germany, Italy, the UK. But in those where it's lower, like the United States notably, interest rates are a hell of a lot higher than they are in Australia. You've got to acknowledge the full story here, haven't you?
I don't know. I haven't seen the detail, David. The devil's in the detail. Without seeing the detail, David, more of the detail. It's impossible to have a detailed discussion. What I will say is inflation. Fight inflation. Inflation. Downward pressure on inflation. Inflation. Downward pressure on inflation. The worst inflation. Inflation. Fighting Vladimir Putin's inflation. Fighting inflation. Fight inflation. Inflation.
All right, I suspect I know the answer to this one too, but I've got to ask job seeker. What about that? Should that be increased?
Well, you know, the truth of the matter right now, David, is inflation. Core inflation, fighting inflation. Inflation, downward pressure on inflation.
But can you just give us one idea as to what they should do to put downward pressure on inflation?
Well, I will emphasise again, the first and most important thing is inflation, because you go
So the Coalition couldn't produce a surplus in 9 years, but you're saying there should be surpluses in every year of the next 4 years for Labor.
Angus. Jesus, Angus.